Gerrymandering. International examples of gerrymandering. Several Western democracies, notably Israel, the Netherlands, Slovakia and Slovenia, employ an electoral system with only one, nationwide, voting district for election of national representatives. This virtually precludes gerrymandering. Other European countries such as Austria, the Czech Republic or Sweden, among many others, have electoral districts with fixed boundaries, usually one district for each administrative division. The number of representatives for each district can change after a census due to population shifts, but their boundaries do not change. This also effectively eliminates gerrymandering. Additionally, many countries where the president is directly elected by the citizens, for example France, Poland, among others, use only one electoral district for presidential election, despite using multiple districts to elect representatives. Australia. Gerrymandering has not typically been considered a problem in the Australian electoral system, largely because drawing of electoral boundaries has typically been done by non-partisan electoral commissions. There have been historical cases of malapportionment, whereby the distribution of electors to electorates was not in proportion to the population in several states. For example, Sir Thomas Playford was Premier of South Australia from 1938 to 1965 as a result of a system of malapportionment, which became known as the Playmander, despite it not strictly speaking involving a gerrymander. More recently, the nominally independent South Australian Electoral Districts Boundaries Commission has been accused of favouring the Australian Labor Party, as the party has been able to form government in 4 of the last 7 elections, despite receiving a lower two-party preferred vote. In Queensland, malapportionment combined with a gerrymander under Premier Sir Joh Bjelke-Petersen became nicknamed the Bjelkemander in the 1970s and 1980s. Under the system, electoral boundaries were drawn so that rural electorates had as few as half as many voters as metropolitan ones, and regions with high levels of support for the opposition Labour Party were concentrated into fewer electorates, allowing Bjelke-Petersen's Country Party, later National Party, led coalition government to remain in power despite attracting substantially less than 50% of the vote. In the 1986 election, for example, the National Party received 39.64% of the first preference vote and won 49 seats, in the 89-seat legislature, whilst the Labour opposition received 41.35% but won only 30 seats. Despite this, the Liberals/Nationals still received a greater combined share of the vote than the Labour opposition because the system also worked against the Liberal representation. Canada. Early in Canadian history, both the federal and provincial levels used gerrymandering to try to maximize partisan power. When Alberta and Saskatchewan were admitted to Confederation in 1905, their original district boundaries were set forth in the respective Alberta and Saskatchewan Acts. These boundaries had been devised by federal Liberal cabinet members to ensure the election of provincial Liberal governments. Since responsibility for drawing federal and provincial electoral boundaries was handed over to independent agencies, this problem has largely been eliminated at these levels of government. Manitoba was the first province to authorize a nonpartisan group to define constituency boundaries in the 1950s. In 1964, the federal government delegated the drawing of boundaries for national seats to the Arm's-Length Elections Canada. As a result, gerrymandering is not generally a major issue in Canada except at the civic level. Although city wards are recommended by independent agencies, city councils occasionally overrule them. This is much more likely where the city is not homogeneous and different neighborhoods have sharply different opinions about city policy direction. In 2006, a controversy arose in Prince Edward Island over the provincial government's decision to throw out an electoral map drawn by an independent commission. Instead, they created 2 new maps. The government adopted the second of these, designed by the caucus of the governing party. Opposition parties and the media attacked Premier Patvins for what they saw as gerrymandering of districts. Among other things, the government adopted a map that ensured that every current member of the Legislative Assembly from the Premier's party had a district to run in for re-election, whereas in the original map, several had been redistricted. Despite this, in the 2007 provincial election only 7 of 20 incumbent members of the Legislative Assembly were re-elected, 7 did not run for re-election, and the government was defeated. Chile. The military government which ruled Chile from 1973 to 1990 was ousted in a national plebiscite in October 1988. Opponents of General Augusto Pinochet voted no to remove him from power and to trigger democratic elections, while supporters, mostly from the right wing, voted yes to keep him in office for another 8 years. 5 months prior to the plebiscite, the regime published a law regulating future elections and referendums, but the configuration of electoral districts and the manner in which Congress seats would be awarded were only added to the law 7 months after the referendum. For the Chamber of Deputies, lower house, 60 districts were drawn by grouping, mostly, neighboring communes, the smallest administrative subdivision in the country, within the same region, the largest. It was established that 2 deputies would be elected per district, with the most voted coalition needing to outpoll its closest rival by a margin of more than 2-1 to take both seats. The results of the 1988 plebiscite show that neither the no side nor the yes side outpolled the other by said margin in any of the newly established districts. They also showed that the vote/seat ratio was lower in districts which supported the yes side and higher in those where the no was strongest. In spite of this, at the 1989 parliamentary election, the center-left opposition was able to capture both seats, the so-called députés, in 12 out of 60 districts, winning control of 60% of the chamber. Senate constituencies were created by grouping all lower chamber districts in a region, or by dividing a region into 2 constituencies of contiguous lower chamber districts. The 1980 Constitution allocated a number of seats to appointed senators, making it harder for one side to change the Constitution by itself. The opposition won 22 Senate seats in the 1989 election, taking both seats in 3 out of 19 constituencies, controlling 58% of the elected Senate, but only 47% of the full Senate. The unelected senators were eliminated in the 2005 constitutional reforms, but the electoral map has remained largely untouched. 2 new regions were created in 2007, one of which altered the composition of 2 senatorial constituencies. The first election to be affected by this minor change took place in 2013. France. France is one of the few countries to let legislatures redraw the map with no check. In practice, the legislature sets up an executive commission. Districts called arrondissements were used in the Third Republic, and under the Fifth Republic they are called circumscriptions. During the Third Republic, some reforms of arrondissements, which were also used for administrative purposes, were largely suspected to have been arranged to favor the kingmaker in the assembly, the Parti Radical. The dissolution of Seine and Seine-et-Oise departments was seen as a case of gerrymandering to counter communist influence around Paris. In the modern regime, there were 3 designs: in 1958, regime change, 1987, by Charles Pasqua, and 2010, by Alain Marleix, 3 times by conservative governments. Pasqua's drawing was known to have been particularly good at gerrymandering, resulting in 80% of the seats with 58% of the vote in 1993. And forcing socialists in the 1997 snap election to enact multiple pacts with smaller parties in order to win again, this time as a coalition. In 2010, the Sarkozy government created 12 districts for expats. The Constitutional Council was called twice by the opposition to decide about gerrymandering, but it never considered partisan disproportions. However, it forced the Marleix Committee to respect an 80 to 120% population ratio, ending a tradition dating back to the revolution in which departments, however small in population, would send at least 2 MPs. Gerrymandering in France is also done against regionalist parties. Departments are always used even if they split urban areas or larger identity territories, and smaller identity divisions are avoided. Germany. When the electoral districts in Germany were redrawn in 2000, the ruling center-left Social Democratic Party, SPD, was accused of gerrymandering to marginalize the left-wing PDS party. The SPD combined traditional PDS strongholds in eastern Berlin with new districts made up of more populous areas of western Berlin, where the PDS had very limited following. After having won 4 seats in Berlin in the 1998 national election, the PDS was able to retain only 2 seats altogether in the 2002 elections. Under German electoral law, A political party has to win either more than 5% of the votes or at least 3 directly elected seats to qualify for top-up seats under the additional member system. The PDS vote fell below 5%, thus they failed to qualify for top-up seats and were confined to just 2 members of the Bundestag, the German federal parliament. Elected representatives are always allowed to hold their seats as individuals. Had they won a third constituency, the PDS would have gained at least 25 additional seats, which would have been enough to hold the balance of power in the Bundestag. In the election of 2005, the left, successor of the PDS, gained 8.7% of the votes and thus qualified for top-up seats. The number of Bundestag seats of parties which traditionally get over 5% of the votes cannot be affected very much by gerrymandering, because seats are awarded to these parties on a proportional basis. However, when a party wins so many districts in any one of the 16 federal states that those seats alone count for more than its proportional share of the vote in that same state does the district and have some influence on larger parties, those extra seats, called Überhangmandate, remain. In the Bundestag election of 2009, Angela Merkel's CDU/CSU gained 24 such extra seats, while no other party gained any. This skewed the result so much that the Federal Constitutional Court of Germany issued 2 rulings declaring the existing election laws invalid and requiring the Bundestag to pass a new law limiting such extra seats to no more than 15. In 2013, Germany's Supreme Court ruled on the constitutionality of Überhangmandate, which from then on have to be added in proportion to the second vote of each party, thereby making it impossible that one party can have more seats than earned by the proportionate votes in the election. Greece. Gerrymandering has been rather common in Greek history since organized parties with national ballots only appeared after the 1926 constitution. The only case before that was the creation of the Piraeus electoral district in 1906, in order to give the Theotokos party a safe district. The most infamous case of gerrymandering was in the 1956 election. While in previous elections the districts were based on the prefecture level, nu Omicron mu sigma, for 1956 the country was split in districts of varying sizes, some being the size of prefectures, some the size of sub-prefectures, epsilon pi alpha rho chi alpha, and others somewhere in between. In small districts the winning party would take all seats, in intermediate size, it would take most, and there was proportional representation in the largest districts. The districts were created in such a way that small districts were those that traditionally voted for the right while large districts were those that voted against the right. This system has become known as the three-phase, tau rho iota phi alpha sigma iota kappa, system, or the baklava system, because, as baklava is split into full pieces and corner pieces, the country was also split into disproportionate pieces. The opposition, being composed of the center and the left, formed a coalition with the sole intent of changing the electoral law and then calling new elections. Even though the centrist and leftist opposition won the popular vote, 1,620,007 votes against 1,594,992, the right-wing heir won the majority of seats, 165 to 135, and was to lead the country for the next 2 years. Hong Kong. In Hong Kong, functional constituencies are demarcated by the government and defined in statutes, making them prone to gerrymandering. The functional constituency for the information technology sector was particularly criticized for gerrymandering and vote planting. There are also gerrymandering concerns in the constituencies of district councils. Hungary. In 2011, Fidesz politician János Lázár has proposed a redesign to Hungarian voting districts. Considering the territorial results of previous elections, this redesign would favor right-wing politics according to the opposition. Since then, the law has been passed by the Fidesz majority parliament. Formerly it took twice as many votes to gain a seat in some election districts as in some others. Ireland. Until the 1980s, Dáil boundaries in Ireland were drawn not by an independent commission but by government ministers. Successive arrangements by governments of all political characters have been attacked as gerrymandering. Ireland uses the single transferable vote, and as well as the actual boundaries drawn, the main tool of gerrymandering has been the number of seats per constituency used, with 3-seat constituencies normally benefiting the strongest parties in an area, whereas 4-seat constituencies normally help smaller parties. In 1947, the rapid rise of new party Klan Napoplakta threatened the position of the governing party Fianna Fáil. The government of Eamon de Valera introduced the Electoral Amendment Act 1947, which increased the size of the Dáil from 138 to 147 and increased the number of three-seat constituencies from 15 to 22. The result was described by the journalist and historian Tim Pat Coogan as a blatant attempt at gerrymander which no six-county unionist could have bettered. The following February, the 1948 general election was held and Klan Napoplakta secured 10 seats instead of the 19 they would have received proportional to their vote. In the mid-1970s, the Minister for Local Government, James Tully, attempted to arrange the constituencies to ensure that the governing Fine Gael Labour Party National Coalition would win a parliamentary majority. The Electoral Amendment Act 1974 was planned as a major reversal of previous gerrymandering by Fianna Fáil, then in opposition. Tully ensured that there were as many as possible three-seat constituencies where the governing parties were strong, in the expectation that the governing parties would each win a seat in many constituencies, relegating Fianna Fáil to 1 out of 3. In areas where the governing parties were weak, 4-seat constituencies were used so that the governing parties had a strong chance of still winning too. The election results created substantial change, as there was a larger than expected collapse in the vote. Fianna Fáil won a landslide victory in the 1977 Irish general election, 2 out of 3 seats in many cases, relegating the national coalition parties to fight for the last seat. Consequently, the term gerrymandering was used to describe the phenomenon of a failed attempt at gerrymandering. Kuwait. From the years 1981 until 2005, Kuwait was divided into 25 electoral districts in order to overrepresent the government's supporters, the tribes. In July 2005, a new law for electoral reforms was approved which prevented electoral gerrymandering by cutting the number of electoral districts from 25 to 5. The government of Kuwait found that 5 electoral districts resulted in a powerful parliament with a majority representing the opposition. A new law was crafted by the government of Kuwait and signed by the emir to gerrymander the districts to 10, allowing the government's supporters to regain the majority. Malaysia. The practice of gerrymandering has been around in the country since its independence in 1957. The ruling coalition at that time, Barisan Nasional, BN, English, National Front, has been accused of controlling the election commission by revising the boundaries of constituencies. For example, during the 13th general election in 2013, Barisan Nasional won 60% of the seats in the Malaysian parliament despite only receiving 47% of the popular vote. Malapportionment has also been used at least since 1974, when it was observed that in one state alone, Perak, the parliamentary constituency with the most voters had more than 10 times as many voters as the one with the fewest voters. These practices finally failed BN in the 14th general election on May 9, 2018, when the opposing Pakatan Harapan, PH, English, Alliance of Hope, won despite perceived efforts of gerrymandering and malapportionment from the incumbent. Malta. The Labour Party that won in 1981, even though the Nationalist Party got the most votes, did so because of its gerrymandering. A 1987 constitutional amendment prevented that situation from reoccurring. Nepal. After the restoration of democracy in 1990, Nepali politics has well exercised the practice of gerrymandering with the view to take advantage in the election. It was often practiced by Nepali Congress, which remained in power in most of the time. Learning from this, the reshaping of constituency was done for Constituent Assembly and the opposition now wins elections. Philippines. Congressional districts in the Philippines were originally based on an ordinance from the 1987 Constitution, which was created by the Constitutional Commission, which was ultimately based on legislative districts as they were drawn in 1907. The same constitution gave Congress of the Philippines the power to legislate new districts, either through a national redistricting bill or piecemeal redistricting per province or city. Congress has never passed a national redistricting bill since the approval of the 1987 Constitution, while it has incrementally created 34 new districts, out of the 200 originally created in 1987. This allows Congress to create new districts once a place reaches 250,000 inhabitants, the minimum required for its creation. With this, local dynasties, through congressmen, can exert influence in the district-making process by creating bills carving new districts from old ones. In time, as the population of the Philippines increases, these districts, or groups of it, will be the basis of carving new provinces out of existing ones. An example was in Camarines Sur, where 2 districts were divided into 3 districts, which allegedly favors the Andayo and the Arroyo families. It caused Rolando Andayo and Dato Arroyo, who would have otherwise run against each other, run in separate districts, with one district allegedly not even surpassing the 250,000 population minimum. The Supreme Court later ruled that the 250,000 population minimum does not apply to an additional district in a province. The resulting splits would later be the cause of another gerrymander, where the province would be split into a new province called Nueva Camarines. The bill was defeated in the Senate in 2013. Singapore. In recent decades, critics have accused the ruling People's Action Party, PAP, of unfair electoral practices to maintain significant majorities in the Parliament of Singapore. Among the complaints are that the government uses gerrymandering. The Elections Department was established as part of the executive branch under the Prime Minister of Singapore, rather than as an independent body. Critics have accused it of giving the ruling party the power to decide polling districts and polling sites through electoral engineering, based on poll results in previous elections. Members of opposition parties claim that the group representation constituency system is synonymous to gerrymandering, pointing out examples of Changsan GRC and Eunos GRC, which were dissolved by the Elections Department with voters redistributed to other constituencies after opposition parties gained ground in elections. Spain. Until the establishment of the Second Spanish Republic in 1931, Spain used both single-member and multi-member constituencies in general elections. Multi-member constituencies were only used in some big cities. Some gerrymandering examples included the districts of Vilademuls or Torroella de Montgrí in Catalonia. These districts were created in order to prevent the Federal Democratic Republican Party to win a seat in Figueres or La Bisbal and to secure a seat to the dynastic parties. Since 1931, the constituency boundaries match the province boundaries. After the Francoist dictatorship, during the transition to democracy, these fixed provincial constituencies were re-established in Section 68.2 of the current 1978 Spanish Constitution, so gerrymandering is impossible in general elections. There are not winner-takes-all elections in Spain except for the tiny territories of Ceuta and Melilla, which only have one representative each. Everywhere else the number of representatives assigned to a constituency is proportional to its population and calculated according to a national law, so tampering with under- or over-representation is difficult too. European, regional and municipal elections are held under single, at-large multi-member constituencies with proportional representation, and gerrymandering is not possible either. Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka's new local government elections process has been the talking point of gerrymandering since its inception. Even though that talk was more about the ward level, it is also seen in some local council areas too. Sudan. In the most recent election of 2010, there were numerous examples of gerrymandering throughout the entire country of Sudan. A report from the Rift Valley Institute uncovered violations of Sudan's electoral law, where constituencies were created that were well below and above the required limit. According to Sudan's National Elections Act of 2008, no constituency can have a population that is 15% greater or less than the average constituency size. The Rift Valley report uncovered a number of constituencies that are in violation of this rule. Examples include constituencies in Jonglei, Warrap, South Darfur, and several other states. Turkey. Turkey has used gerrymandering in Istanbul in 2009 municipal elections. Just before the election, Istanbul is divided in new counties. Large low-income boroughs are bundled with rich boroughs to win municipal elections. United Kingdom. Northern Ireland. Gerrymandering, Irish, Clay and Rowand, is widely considered to have been introduced after the establishment of Home Rule in Northern Ireland in 1921, favoring Unionists who tended to be Protestant, to the detriment of Nationalists who were mostly Catholic. Some critics and supporters spoke at the time of the Protestant Parliament for a Protestant people. This passed also into local government. Stephen Gwynn had noted as early as 1911 that since the introduction of the Local Government, Ireland, Act 1898. In Armagh there are 68,000 Protestants, 56,000 Catholics. The county council has 22 Protestants and 8 Catholics. In Tyrone, Catholics are a majority of the population, 82,000 against 68,000, but the electoral districts have been so arranged that Unionists return 16 as against 13 Nationalists, 1 a Protestant. This council gives to the Unionists 2-1 majority on its committees, and out of 52 officials employs only 5 Catholics. In Antrim, which has the largest Protestant majority, 196,000 to 40,000, 26 Unionists and 3 Catholics are returned. 60 officers out of 65 are good Unionists and Protestants. In the 1920s and 1930s, the Ulster Unionist Party created new electoral boundaries for the Londonderry County Borough Council to ensure election of a Unionist council in a city where Nationalists had a large majority and had won previous elections. Initially local parties drew the boundaries, but in the 1930s the province-wide government redrew them to reinforce the gerrymander. However, in the 1967 election, Unionists won 35.5% of the votes and received 60% of the seats, while Nationalists got 27.4% of the votes but received 40% of the seats. This meant that both the Unionist and Nationalist parties were overrepresented, while the Northern Ireland Labour Party and Independents, amounting to more than 35% of the votes cast, were severely underrepresented. From the outset, Northern Ireland had installed the Single Transferable Vote (STV) system in order to secure fair elections in terms of proportional representation in its parliament. After 2 elections under that system, in 1929 Stormont changed the electoral system to be the same as the rest of the United Kingdom, a single-member first-past-the-post system. The only exception was for the election of 4 Stormont MPs to represent the Queen's University of Belfast. Some scholars believe that the boundaries were gerrymandered to underrepresent Nationalists. Other geographers and historians, for instance Professor John H. White, disagree. They have argued that the electoral boundaries for the Parliament of Northern Ireland were not gerrymandered to a greater level than that produced by any single winner election system, and that the actual number of Nationalist MPs barely changed under the revised system. It went from 12 to 11 and later went back up to 12. Most observers have acknowledged that the change to a single winner system was a key factor, however, in stifling the growth of smaller political parties, such as the Northern Ireland Labour Party and Independent Unionists. After Westminster reintroduced direct rule in 1973, it restored the Single Transferable Vote (STV) for elections to the Northern Ireland Assembly in the following year, using the same definitions of constituencies as for the Westminster Parliament. Currently, in Northern Ireland, all elections use STV except those for positions in the Westminster Parliament, which follow the pattern in the rest of the United Kingdom by using first-past-the-post. Boundary review. The number of electors in the United Kingdom constituency can vary considerably, with the smallest constituency currently, 2017 electoral register, having fewer than a fifth of the electors of the largest, Scotland's Chile and Anir, 21,769 constituents, and Orkney and Shetland, 34,552, compared to England's North West Cambridgeshire, 93,223, and Isle of Wight, 110,697. This variation has resulted from Scotland and Wales being favoured in the Westminster Parliament with deliberately smaller electoral quotas, average electors per constituency, than those in England and Northern Ireland. This inequality was initiated by the House of Commons, Redistribution of Seats, Act 1958, which eliminated the previous common electoral quota for the whole United Kingdom and replaced it with 4 separate national quotas for the respective boundaries commissions to work to, England 69,534. Northern Ireland 67,145, Wales 58,383 and in Scotland only 54,741 electors. current rules historically favoring geographically natural districts, this continues to give proportionally greater representation to Wales and Scotland. Population migrations, due to white flight and deindustrialization tending to decrease the number of electors in inner-city districts. Under the 6th Periodic Review of Westminster constituencies, the coalition government planned to review and redraw the parliamentary constituency boundaries for the House of Commons of the United Kingdom. The review and redistricting was to be carried out by the 4 UK boundary commissions to produce a reduction from 650 to 600 seats, and more uniform sizes, such that a constituency was to have no fewer than 70,583 and no more than 80,473 electors. The process was intended to address historic malapportionment, and be complete by 2015. Preliminary reports suggesting the areas set to lose the fewest seats historically tended to vote Conservative, while other less populous and deindustrialized regions, such as Wales, which would lose a larger proportion of its seats, tending to have more Labour and Liberal Democrat voters, partially correcting the existing malapportionment. An opposition, Labour, motion to suspend the review until after the next general election was tabled in the House of Lords and a vote called in the United Kingdom House of Commons, in January 2013. The motion was passed with the help of the Liberal Democrats, going back on an election pledge. As of October 2016, a new review is in progress and a draft of the new boundaries has been published. United States. The United States, among the first with an elected representative government, eventually named the practice. Incidents precede the 1789 election of the first U.S. Congress. In 1788, Patrick Henry and his anti-federalist allies were in control of the Virginia House of Delegates. They drew the boundaries of Virginia's 5th congressional district in an unsuccessful attempt to keep James Madison out of the U.S. House of Representatives via the candidacy of James Monroe. The practice of gerrymandering the borders of new states continued past the Civil War and into the late 19th century. The Republican Party used its control of Congress to secure the admission of more states and territories friendly to their party, the admission of Dakota Territory as 2 states instead of 1 being a notable example. By the rules for representation in the Electoral College, each new state carried at least 3 electoral votes regardless of its population. All redistricting in the United States has been contentious because it has been controlled by political parties vying for power. As a consequence of the decennial census required by the United States Constitution, districts for members of the House of Representatives typically need to be redrawn whenever the number of members in a state changes. In many states, state legislatures redraw boundaries for state legislative districts at the same time. State legislatures have used gerrymandering along racial lines both to decrease and increase minority representation in state governments and congressional delegations. In Ohio, a conversation between Republican officials was recorded that demonstrated that redistricting was being done to aid their political candidates. Furthermore, the discussions assessed the race of voters as a factor in redistricting, on the premise that African Americans tend to back Democratic candidates. Republicans apparently removed approximately 13,000 African American voters from the district of Jim Rouson, a Republican candidate for the House of Representatives, in an attempt to tip the scales in what was once a competitive district for Democratic candidates. With the Civil Rights Movement and passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, federal enforcement and protections of suffrage for all citizens were enacted. Gerrymandering for the purpose of reducing the political influence of a racial or ethnic minority group was prohibited. After the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was passed, some states created majority-minority districts to enhance minority voting strength. This practice, also called affirmative gerrymandering, was supposed to redress historic discrimination and ensure that ethnic minorities would gain some seats and representation in government. In some states, bipartisan gerrymandering is the norm. State legislators from both parties sometimes agree to draw congressional district boundaries in a way that ensures the re-election of most or all incumbent representatives from both parties. Rather than allowing more political influence, some states have shifted redistricting authority from politicians and given it to nonpartisan redistricting commissions. The states of Washington, Arizona, and California have created standing committees for redistricting following the 2010 census. It has been argued, however, that in California's case, gerrymandering still continued despite this change. Rhode Island and New Jersey have developed ad hoc committees, but developed the past 2 decennial reapportionments tied to new census data. Florida's Amendments 5 and 6, meanwhile, established rules for the creation of districts but did not mandate an independent commission. International election observers from the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights, who were invited to observe and report on the 2004 national elections, expressed criticism of the U.S. congressional redistricting process and made a recommendation that the procedures be reviewed to ensure genuine competitiveness of congressional election contests. In 2015, an analyst reported that the two major parties differ in the way they redraw districts. The Democrats construct coalition districts of liberals and minorities together with conservatives, which results in Democratic leaning districts. The Republicans tend to place liberals all together in a district, conservatives in others, creating clear partisan districts. In June 2019, the United States Supreme Court chose to dismiss a case about gerrymandering because consenting members cited lack of federal jurisdiction over redistricting on a state level. Venezuela. Prior to the September 26, 2010 legislative elections, gerrymandering took place via an addendum to the electoral law by the National Assembly of Venezuela. In the subsequent election, Hugo Chávez's political party, the United Socialist Party of Venezuela, drew 48% of the votes overall, while the opposition parties, the Democratic Unity Roundtable and the Fatherland for All parties, drew 52% of the votes. However, due to the reallocation of electoral legislative districts prior to the election, Chávez's United Socialist Party of Venezuela was awarded over 60% of the spots in the National Assembly, 98 deputies, while 67 deputies were elected for the two opposition parties combined.